as a Prime Minister, you have to have a story. You have to be able to think what's wrong with the country and how the things that I'm going to do can solve people's main issues and tell a story. I felt that's what Starmer tried to do and then go, well, why don't we have a great story? It's because you're a bit of a political vacuum. The reality is it's much easier for everybody in the room if it's a comms problem. The ones that used to always sort of drive me slightly crackers would be the self-inflicted wounds that you would often have. And I think for me, the ones that stand out were particularly during COVID. Boris sort of squinting his eyes, being like, Commissar, it's a comms problem, one that I'm sure you can resolve. And I remember saying that, this won't last 24 hours.
Welcome to In the Room, Lessons from Number 10. It's our summer series on what it's like to work behind that famous black front door. My name's Cleo Watson. I used to be a special advisor to Theresa May and Boris Johnson.
And I'm Helen McNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary. And this week, we're very excited to be joined by Lee Cain.
He started as a tabloid journalist when he briefly became famous for wearing the Daily Mirror's chicken costume covering David Cameron. And then he went on to become Boris Johnson's Director of Communications in Downing Street.
Lee was a key figure in the Vote Leave campaign. He helped to shape the Conservatives' general election victory in 2019, and he was the Director of Communications in Downing Street during the COVID pandemic and responsible for some of the clearest and most effective political messaging in the modern age.
Lee, welcome to In the Room.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming along. Very brave of you. Let's start at the beginning, before the rows, before COVID, before indeed Downing Street and your first career, if that's okay. So you obviously became one of the most powerful figures in government when you became Director of Communications, but you had a little stint in a chicken costume for the
Glorious
Mirror,
stint, I would
and
argue.
you cut your teeth, I believe, at the Gloucester Citizen, and I know that because our producer is from Gloucester and he was an avid reader. What did you understand about political comms before you came into the job, and then what surprised you once you got there?
Very little, I would say, in terms of political comms. My background was a journalist from, I actually started on the Leek Post and Times in the Staffordshire Moorlands, which was a fantastic local paper. They had like 9 or 10 journalists on this once a week local paper.
Leek, really?
In Leek Post. It's fantastic,
Wow.
Fantastic time. Lots of long lunches, wonderful. And then sort of moved through various local papers and news agencies and then onto nationals. But I was a news reporter, very much like, if you remember the if any older listeners here, the pigs in spitting image, where they used to wear sort of old trench coats and hats with press in it, and then they'd sort of run round after celebrities and things. That was I spent a lot of time for. So it was not the sort of strategic political comms that I would come to enjoy, much more about news cycles and sort of daily tactics. And what is a good story fundamentally? How do you write a good story? What grabs the attention of a reader? It was much more focused on those things as opposed to the strategic roles that I would go into.
Can I just ask, so how did you go from that into working for Boris Johnson?
Yeah, I'm not sure myself sometimes, actually. It was quite a pivot. I remember I was working for a rather sleepy law firm in PR to try and pay off the huge amounts of debt I'd managed to get from university and other such things. And I saw an advert for the Vote Leave as some sort of media officer and sent a CV and assumed that I would have no chance of being sifted for that. You'd have to have sort of contacts and networks and all those other such things, not realising that nobody in politics was going to work for Vote Leave because it was seen as a bit of sort of career suicide. It was only real...
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah,
It's worked out okay for you two.
It was, I think it was only true believers who were there. So they didn't have huge numbers of people. And I think, Dominic, who we've worked with, is probably a lot more open to external people from outside the Westminster bubble. So there was an opportunity there, and from that moment, things just tend to happen. It was a bit of a whirlwind.
Well, famously, Vote Leave, where we both worked and where we met, had incredible message discipline. What else did you learn from that campaign that you then were able to take into your later career? One
of the things that I think Dominic instilled in everybody on that campaign is to be incredibly voter focused. We knew who was our audience, what to say, how to say it, who to say it to, in order to sort of build the broadest possible coalition for what we were trying to communicate. And I think I learned pretty much everything that was worth learning in the sort of 4 or 5 months during that campaign.
Why is it that a campaign like that seems to be able to achieve things that a government press office can't seem to manage. So we have a new Prime Minister at the moment who seems to want to do communications differently, but he's sort of come in as a campaigner and now he's the Prime Minister. What's your take on the idea of being, an insurgent campaigner versus actually the establishment? And government comms always just seems more difficult.
We only had, I think, 8 people on the comms team at Vote Leave. It's an incredibly small number. Where if you look at, say, something like the Home Office or, whatever the business department's going to be called these days, you're looking at 250 comms people plus. It's an extraordinary amount of people. And there will be some great talent in there, but it's just far too many people, undefined roles, undefined goals. So it often just gets lost. They don't really know who they're talking to. A lot of the platforms, like we have hundreds of campaigns that don't really have metrics of who we're trying to talk to, what behaviour change do we want, what are the outcomes we're looking to change. And I think even in somewhere like Number 10, where it's a much smaller team than around the rest of government, one of the core elements is like, what are we trying to do? What is the big problem that is facing the country? What are our priorities? How are we remaining focused on those? And what's the sort of moral story we're looking to tell? Even with Andy Burnham now, I think there's some really good content, and it's interesting content. But again, what's the moral story they're trying to say? How will all of those pieces piece together? It's all very tactical. I'm not seeing a huge amount of like long-term strategic communications. There's plenty of time for that to come. But I think that's the core thing of like, what is the focus? What you are actually trying to do ahead of whenever the next election is? How do you want people to think of you and your government? And I think that's still unclear.
I do remember that one of the conversations you and I had, it was during COVID, but COVID was one of those experiences in government where, as well as all of the kind of shocking things about the pandemic, it showed you some shocking things about your own government that you worked in. I remember you had some really brilliant plans for kind of actually what we would do about comms, because we had discovered far too late in the day that the government system just wasn't set up to actually talk to actual people. I remember sitting there in the office with like all of the maps of how many people there were, to your point, of working in different government departments on the comms, kind of so-called on comms. You just think we've actually institutionalised these people just briefing against each other. As well, we've created this machine that occupies all the space and tells stories against itself all the time.
If you look at the Government Communication Service, which is the GCS for short, that when I started, I was told by the executive director, who's actually in charge of the government communications. So I would often get the blame for government communications, but controlled about 5% of it. This sort of whole section is run by the sort of within civil service, and
that's why we like having political people.
Yeah, exactly. Helpful lightning rods.
Helpful lightning rods.
But I was told there was 4,000 people working in government comms. So asked for an audit, and then it was actually there's 8,000 people, which I still think is probably an underball. And then we have to say, actually, well, let's look at how we can make this more efficient, more effective. And it's like, well, we can't lose a single person. Was what came back, and it's like, well, we just found 4,000 people we didn't know existed 3 days ago, so it can't be that critical. But that was, and there was a real hostility for trying to streamline in a way, in a corporate sense, you would never get. It's all about how we can be more efficient. There is no upshot in government to be more efficient. It's actually, you become a bit of a lightning rod for people if you start saying, well, we should be more efficient. I remember, in the previous Starmer administration, there was a whole thing about how we're going to streamline GCS and all these exciting comms things we're going to do. As far as I'm aware, none of it has happened, and it'd be interesting to see what focus communications has in the new government. I suspect we're going to see just a lot more people hired in different titles, and I think we were talking earlier on about all of the new digital people that are coming on board, and more people does not necessarily mean better quality comms, and I think I'd have fewer people trained to a higher standard would be what I'd focus on more.
It certainly doesn't give you that big story or the reason for being or any of those other things.
Well, that's a very different thing, and it's quite funny. I remember with Starmer, and we're sort of going off down a sort of Labour avenue, but I think with Starmer there was an awful lot of talk about bad comms and he needs more comms people, and had some very capable comms people, but your comms people won't develop your story for you. As a Prime Minister, you have to have a story. You have to be able to think what's wrong with the country and how the things that I'm going to do are going to solve people's main issues and tell a story. That's not something you offset to someone else to do. They can turn your ideas and thoughts and everything else into a powerful, emotive story, but you can't offset that. And I felt that's what Starmer tried to do, and then go, well, why don't we have a great story? It's because you're a bit of a political vacuum. So again, it'd be interesting to see what Burnham's story is and if he tries to tackle that. And I think he probably will, because he seems more in tune with that element and having a story to tell to the country.
very quickly, can you talk about your expectations of going into number 10? You came off the back of a big leadership contest, which Andy Burnham has happily not had to fight. And then there you were in Downing Street. What were you expecting, and then what was the reality?
I had a bit of a view already because I'd worked briefly in number 10 under Theresa May, which with you as well, which you've clearly forgotten already. So
I've forgotten that.
Well, because I'd been working with Michael Gove in DEFRA, and the then director of comms, Robbie Gibb, asked me to come on board and work with on Theresa's team, and I was like, media
what?
I was like media spad number 15. You know,
I
sort of.
literally don't remember that. That's terrible.
Yeah, I was
One of the 8,000.
Yeah. I was there quite briefly. I was there 2 or 3 months and felt things weren't great, and that the political strategy they had over Brexit was going to go off a cliff. And an opportunity came to work with Boris, so then I moved over to the Foreign Office and went to work with Boris. But I'd spent a couple of months in number 10 and had a bit of a feel for the structures, so I wasn't totally blinded.
Oh, so did you have your eye on that big office at the time?
I did. Well, do you know, I never wanted to do the press secretary job, which probably would have been the natural fit when I was, after that leadership campaign, but I made a very strong pitch to take the director of comms job, because the press secretary job is awful, because every day you are just harangued by the lobby and have to be grilled, and it's quite an unforgiving arena, where the director of comms hangs with the Prime Minister and
in Gordon Brown's old office,
thinks big thoughts in this beautiful large oak panelled room with sort of sofa and large mahogany desk and
overlooking the garden. It's by far the most beautiful office in Downing Street.
Bulletproof windows as well, someone told me. I don't know if that's true. You probably know better than I do.
Some of them were.
Fantastic. So you didn't know which one wasn't. Crikey. So I had a vague idea of what to expect. I think even in that sort of interim period, though, what was for me surprising, when you came in, there was no digital function really to speak of. There was no broadcast function. I think the previous directors of comms had come from the BBC, so had sort of taken quite out of the weight, like, obviously Craig Oliver and Robbie Gibb, they'd taken a bit of the weight of the broadcast element, but there was no institutional broadcast expertise. Everything was set up to feed and appease the print lobby, which you obviously have to feed the beast. But it felt to me that if Alistair Campbell would have walked in on that day in 2019, it would have felt very similar to what he had in 1997. To a degree, I don't think it would have felt especially different to Bernard Ingham. And when you think in the period of time, say 1997 to 2019, how different the means of communication were in the country, how people were getting their news, it's extraordinary to think how far government comms lagged behind that, and it's still to catch up, I would argue. I think we moved things on a bit. I think COVID, one of the things we were able to do in COVID was really turbocharge some of that stuff, particularly on the digital side. But it's still lagging behind what you would expect for Downing Street.
Well, come on, Keir Starmer's got a Substack, so
fantastic. We all wish we had a Substack.
On the cusp of things.
So take us back into your time in number 10 then, Lee. Can you give us a bit of a flavour about what it was like? What's a genuinely bad day? How did your days work? And give us an example of a bad one.
I mean, they're all bad days. I mean, there's degrees of bad days, I would argue. They are, I think, I'd broadly be up about sort of 5, half 5. Because I'm still quite old-fashioned, we used to have the papers delivered to my house, so I'd sort of go through those and listen to the sort of headlines in the morning. You'd have multiple WhatsApps to get through, and you're sort of trying to juggle that with getting a small child ready for school and all those other things. Phones, so you have all of that before you leave. I would aim to get into the office for about 7:30. We'd have a team meeting in the comm side. Then you have the sort of senior team meeting, pre-PM meeting, and you go through it like just all day is meeting. Your phone's always going crazy, and I would normally finish, I'd try and get out between sort of like 9 and 10, dependent. You watch the 10 o'clock news, you deal with some more, and it's just this relentless cycle on a daily basis. And I think it's Obama who always said, the problem with those sorts of jobs is you only deal with the hardest problems, because if they weren't the hardest problems, they'd have been solved somewhere else. So everything's a really difficult sort of 50-50 political call. But then there are moments that are, even worse than the bad days. And the ones that used to always sort of drive me slightly crackers would be the self-inflicted wounds that you would often have. And I think for me, the ones that stand out were particularly during COVID. I remember very early on when we were looking, I don't know if you were in this meeting, but when we were looking to deal with the rising R rate, and we had a meeting with the Department of Health, the Treasury, and Number 10. And it was suggested that we should close pubs and clubs because they are a vector for social mixing. So there's a lot of
I think that's what the youth
fun.
call them.
Yeah. So people go, they mix it, obviously at high rates, and they're drunk as well. And there's a comparatively smaller economic benefit. So the Department of Health, this is an area we think we should close first. The Treasury, ironically now looking back, were like, absolutely insane. We can't close any part of the economy. This would be crazy. We'd have to bail them out. It's an absolute disaster. We can't do it. And somebody from the Mited, I think it might have been Boris, I can't remember, but somebody said, I know what we should do. We should leave the pubs and clubs open, but we should tell people not to go to them because it's dangerous.
Oh, I remember that.
Right?
Yeah.
And I remember, because it's just such a bonkers thing to do. I remember looking at James Slack, who was the wonderful official spokesman on the civil service side, and he had the same look of horror in his eyes that I did, knowing that he was going to have to try and explain this to the media. And I remember saying, as my sort of role as a sort of political Cassandra at the time, that perhaps this wasn't the best of all worlds that it was being spun in this room. It was possibly the worst of all worlds because the pubs and clubs will howl and demand a bailout still because, fewer people are going to be going because we're telling everybody not to. And on the flip side, we're going to have a situation where the R rate is still going to grow because some people will be going. So we're not going to control the virus. So we're going to get all the pain and none of the benefit. To which sort of, Boris sort of squinting his eyes, being like, Commissar, it's a comms problem, one that I'm sure you can resolve. And I remember saying that, this won't last 24 hours. We will not hold this position because people will simply ask, if people shouldn't go, which you're suggesting, why don't we close the pubs and clubs? Like, why aren't we doing that? Like, what's our answer? Like, it's, So we'd go through that, and then 12 hours later there'd be a whole series of stories being like how the government comms is a mess and they don't know what they're doing and isn't it a disaster. We would U-turn because that's what happened quite frequently at that point. So we'd U-turn very quickly. Boris would lament the whole thing and say, well, how do we get in this idea? I never thought of that. I didn't want to do this. How did we end up in this position? And then the papers would write pieces about how we needed a new comms team because they were clearly out their depth and didn't know what they were doing. And it would drive
wring the mirror chicken's neck.
It would drive you bonkers because it was so avoidable, and it was just a slow moving car crash. And that did happen particularly at the start of COVID. It happened quite a few times. Luckily, I think once, even in politics, once people, make the same mistake over and over again, they did start listening, I think, to the sort of comms professionals in there and start going, actually, we could probably save ourselves, some pain here. But that happened more often than I would care for.
Every time you say it's a comms problem, I can see the slight grimace on your face because that is the thing that we used to all sit in rooms and raise eyebrows at. Talk us about why that is not usually the answer.
Well, it became a running joke in our administration, didn't it? The reality is it's much easier for everybody in the room if it's a comms problem. So if there is a strategic position that is taken by the government and there is a policy, and it's usually the Prime Minister, if you're in the cabinet room, the Prime Minister is probably alighted on a particular policy and it's a disaster, it's much easier for everyone to turn around and go, oh, actually, the brilliant policy is not the problem. The problem is just how we're explaining that particular policy. That's where it is, because it's much easier for everyone to go, it's your fault as the comms person. If you turn around and go, actually, the policy's to blame, well, then we've all got to sit there and look at who's developed that policy. So there's a very rational reason why everybody just keeps blaming comms. And then after 3 or 4 times of sacking your comms people kind of go, oh, maybe just the principal's a duffer.
I do also remember that, and that to your point about in number 10, you don't get to kind of make the easy choice, you only get to make the difficult choice. That quite often I definitely used to tactically use the comms, try and get the comms team. If I knew a policy was a disaster and a really bad idea and was going to be impossible, you try and get the comms team to kill it sooner rather than later by just doing the practical, this doesn't work, I can't explain it. There aren't 3 sentences you can string together that make this possible.
I remember distinctly listening into a phone call in the 2019 general election when the Conservatives had a candidate who inevitably had said some very unfortunate things. Boris Johnson did not want to jettison this guy as a candidate, and there was a long pause on the call, and I just heard you say, Okay, boss. Well, let's pretend that you're going on the Today programme tomorrow on Radio 4. Question 1, do you think it is acceptable to use the following language? And you just heard this sort of hissing as he sucked his teeth, and he was like, oh, God, got to get rid of him. And being able to use comms like that in a quite a defensive move, it was comms jiu-jitsu.
Well, I think, I think he was getting quite a lot of pressure from other quarters of the campaign to hold on to candidates, and it was a ridiculous position to be in. And I think I remember at the time there was a good half a dozen women on the campaign who were threatening to quit because it was an appalling thing the guy had said, and he should have clearly gone. And I think sometimes just bringing that into the light and saying, well, you can go and defend it, then I think people then have a slightly different vantage point when it's kind of like, oh, I have to go and talk about this, and So yeah, you can use comms for good on occasion, which is nice.
Comms for good. That's a lovely phrase.
There's a book, isn't it? I mean, bestseller.
I've been wondering though. I mean, we've seen Andy Burnham. He's just come in, and there's been much excitement because he's doing comms differently. They send emails at 6 a.m. instead of midnight to embargo stories and make things more difficult for newspapers, for example. Lots of directors of communications come in and do new things. I remember in February 2020, under your stewardship, we were going to have a different way of running the lobby, so that instead of being a kind of behind closed doors briefing that the public are not party to, you were going to build a multimedia suite and have a kind of White House style.
We did build
you
the suite.
You did build it, sorry.
And then use it straight away, almost.
Yeah. Yes, well then, we had to use it for COVID in the end. But the idea was to essentially level the playing field on lobby briefing so that the public could see the questions being asked and how they were being answered. That didn't work though. There was a boycott by the lobby to this plan. Why is it that so many directors of communications want to come and do something new and then ultimately fail?
I mean, firstly, the lobby didn't boycott it. The lobby were broadly fine because they then get to go on TV and be minor celebrities, which was kind of one of the worries with the plan. It didn't happen because I think there was a lot of, I think at editor level, people sort of spooked the PM at the time to say, the bad story that will be out will suddenly be top of the 10. Which was, I thought, sort of insanity, really, because the bad story is already top of the 10. If it's a
top
bad
of the
story,
10 is in 10 o'clock news.
Yeah. It's already dominating the news agenda, and I think people misunderstood what an on-camera briefing was for. This wasn't a broadcast tool. It was a digital tool. This was about making a social first move, because you, as a government, you may have 5 interesting announcements on a particular day, one of which the lobby want to talk about. But say you have, investments in new nursery school places, and we're going to give X amount of billions to nursery school, blah blah blah. Most people don't hear that. Now, it'd be much better if you have your on-camera briefing, you have a press secretary who will deliver that message, and you've got content. You could then take that content and use social media platforms. Maybe you're on Facebook, wherever your audience is. You can put some spend in there from government spend, and you can ensure that people are actually seeing it, and you can be where they are. And that would have put the government much further ahead, because we'd be using, again, social first. And I think one of the things that Andy Burnham is doing, which is obviously the right thing to do, it's a social first approach. I mean, this is not revolutionary. This is what government should have been doing for an awful long time. You look at things and, the majority of people get their news from social media. That is where people are now, through a variety of different channels. It's over, my wonderful company, Charlesby, available for all reassuringly expensive strategic communication needs. When we did a survey last year, we did a report on where people get their news from, and, Facebook has now overtaken the BBC as the primary source of news for most people in this country. And most people wouldn't see Facebook as the big thing anymore, but it's where people are. So obviously, as a political actor, as a government, you need to be where people are, and you need to say your message as many places as possible. That doesn't mean that the lobby still isn't important. The lobby isn't critically important, because they do set some of the tone of how you're perceived. But you need to be everywhere, everything, everywhere, all at once, so to speak, I think, in modern communications. And I think they've made an encouraging start tactically in just getting out in that format.
But do you think it's going to stay? Do you think it's going to stick, or do you think inevitably things slide back?
It's inevitable that there is more and more focus on social media just because that's where the eyeballs are. So there's going to be more of that. I think most directors of communications actually don't try and change anything at all. They just do the same thing, which is go in and play to the lobby. That is where your pressure points are. That is also where the principal wants you to be, because most of these people don't have an understanding of modern communications. They don't really know what they're hiring. So this is another big reason why we've seen such a churn through directors of communications in politics is because people hire people with the wrong skill set. So a prime minister will come in, they will usually find a journalist or someone who's worked within the political team whose job fundamentally has been media management. It is what is the story of the day? How do we get the best top line on that story of the day? And we sort of win the day. Journalists are brilliant for that because they've got the understanding of the media cycles and what's a great top line. So it's like winning today. But your director of comms is a different role entirely. Your director of comms is someone looking at the next election and working backwards and working out what is the moral story we're telling the country. And once you've got that sort of moral story, that should help you when you're developing your policy, because your policy should align and fit in with the moral story you're trying to tell, so it's coherent to the public and they understand what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it, so it all fits together. So most of my job, and it used to drive certain members of the lobby mad because they thought my job was to be on the phone to them all day. I think Boris thought my job was to be on the phone to them all day, but my actual job was to be in the room in number 10, to sit next to Boris, and when someone come in with a slightly batshit plan that was totally at odds with what we were trying to do and would confuse the country, because it's kind of like, oh, you want to do X, but you're saying Y, so it doesn't make sense to us. It's to keep us on track. An example of which, for example, it would be during COVID. So, our key message is stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. So we're encouraging everyone to stay home, stop social mixing. Very important. Don't mix with people or people will die. Very simple, clear message for everyone. And one of the senior team in number 10 with a sort of business hat on, understandably, came in and said, well, we spoke to the airlines and they're all going crazy and they're worried that they're all going to go out of business, and we need to allow the airlines to basically let people fly into the UK. We've got to do that. And in number 10, the view was, we should do that. We should let people come into the UK. But we're also making people stay at home. So it's kind of like, you can't go out and mix, but we can import COVID from abroad and let people sort of mix around that way. It's totally incoherent and it undermines your message, and it means you will get fewer people being willing to adhere to the rules that you're setting. So it's what's our coherent, sensible story. So my job was to be in there and kill the stuff that was undermining us.
And you did a very good job of that. But let's be frank, a coherent moral story and Boris Johnson aren't natural bedfellows in people's minds. So how do you square that circle?
In what way?
Well, so how did you, when you were doing that job for Boris Johnson, what was the moral message that you were trying to communicate for the government?
So I think during our time, it was relatively simple because there were two very clear challenges. So you always have to ask yourself, what is the biggest problem facing the country today and how do we solve that? The two things for us, firstly, was the sort of get Brexit done, which was the first half. The whole sort of premiership, that half was about Brexit. People saw that in all of our sort of research, and I think this is a core thing for anyone looking to do sort of communications. We were incredibly research focused, so we understood the voters, we understood who we were talking to and what we needed to tell them. And we knew from the research that we'd done before we even walked into number 10, we knew that obviously Brexit was the challenge. People thought it was a blocker. It was stopping us focusing on the things that they really cared about, the NHS, policing, education, etc. So we had to tell a story of, hey, we're going to get Brexit done, and then we move on to something else. So we would, even visually, we'd get Boris out at things like hospitals and police stations and such like that. And so you'd turn on the BBC 6 o'clock news, you would see Jeremy Corbyn and Dominic Grieve and all these other people sort of shouting at each other in a sort of zoo of Parliament that everyone was fed up with. And then you'd turn to the next item, it would be Boris, and they'd be asking him about Brexit, but he'd be in a hospital surrounded by nurses. Very clear message, which is, listen, we're going to get Brexit done, bum, 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 and that's why we're going to get 50,000 new nurses or whatever it might be. And you see that. So even if you had the sound off, you would see a very clear story from Boris and what he was trying to do and what the government was trying to achieve. So that was sort of stage one. And then after the election, we pretty much fell into COVID. So again, the story then was stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. How do we control the R rate? How do we keep people alive, etc. So very difficult, huge things to sort of be part of and work on. Very challenging, but in some regards simple because they were sort of one issues. Now, if you're Andy Burnham, the question is, it's about cost of living. People are feeling poorer. They're incredibly unhappy. How do you tell a story about making this country better off and making everybody better off? And I think that's the big circle to square, which is tough.
You talked a bit about the Director of Communications job. It wasn't the only job that you were in the frame for, at least, when you were in Downing Street. So at one point you were tipped to be the Chief of Staff. What do you think is different about being the Chief of Staff from the dock? And did you really want to do that?
As you'll know, Downing Street is a court, and titles themselves, I think, can be a little bit misleading. I think during my time in Downing Street, there was probably like 6 or 7 people who made the weather. People who could go in, to see the PM whenever they wanted, could walk into into any meeting that had that direct access to him, and he would listen. And that proximity to power is basically how the whole building moves and survives. Chief of Staff, I think, it's a slightly ridiculous term because there is no Chief of Staff. Like, if you understand how Number 10 works, if the political so-called Chief of Staff is not our Chief of Staff, they are the head of the political team, and they are basically the Prime Minister's primary political advisor. But the Chief of Staff, in essence, should be the PPS, the Principal Private Secretary, Number 10, which is a hugely powerful role that no one really focuses on or pays any attention to.
Well, stay tuned in Lessons from Number 10 to hear from a PPS coming up.
Right. So, but that's, so I think to be a Chief of Staff, it's not the White House where you actually do control all of the staff and can dictate the rhythm of the day. It's not quite like that. So I think, yes, there is some additional responsibility. You'd be the point person dealing with the White House and things like that, So there'll be a lot more. I think it's a lot more pressured and there's a lot more focus on you. But some of the day-to-day would have been relatively similar because, I probably spent more time, because the way Dom operated and the fact that he was arguably slightly resentful of Boris most of the time, I probably spent a lot of time as the sort of Boris whisperer during that time and spent more time than anybody else, I would say, being that sort of political advisor alongside probably Eddie Lister. So,
well, and trying to solve problems in the day. That's what I remember, is that actually trying to make the fix work.
Yeah. So in some ways, I think my role probably would have stayed similar had I took it. I also knew realistically that it wouldn't have worked. I think the parliamentary party, I felt I'd had enough of the sort of vote leave axis and wouldn't have swallowed it. And I think that was when it sort of was leaked by some rotter into the Times. I think it felt like it was a non-starter. But it's flattering. I think when you get asked, it's a flattering thing, and you sort of, it's one of those wonderful things in politics. You can convince yourself of things that are not good. You're like, maybe actually a couple of years, it'd be fantastic, and I could turn it all around. But no, I don't think it's ever really a starter.
You did get a taste of power, though, didn't you? Because I remember quite early on in COVID when Boris Johnson was very unwell, and in fact, most of the staff got COVID, and you were basically in charge, running the country.
Clear.
Yes, I think it literally was just the three of us. I certainly remember having a very frightening conversation in a little room where we realised the Constitution didn't really provide for what to do if the Prime Minister is really unwell, and we wrote it down, and it was. Don't worry, everyone. It was all good.
I remember going in for a meeting because I had COVID the week before and was self-isolating, and then came in because Martin, who was our PPS, had called and sort of said, it's Boris taking a bit of a turn for the worst, and in the way that Martin does,
meaning he was on his way to hospital.
Yeah.
Emergency.
And we came in, and I remember sort of looking at you and Mark Sedwell, who was the cabinet secretary at the time. And realising that there wasn't a plan. And I remember looking at you for reassurance.
Helen is a very reassuring figure in these circumstances. Yeah.
When Helen looks worried, you should be worried.
I think very quickly afterwards there was a very good plan with serif font that looked like it had existed for a very long time. I think you remember.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, it was. I always remember walking into the cabinet room that day, and I coming a bit later, and like the PM's chair has arms on it. It's a fantastic detail that no one else in cabinet's chair has arms on except for the PM's, which it's a power play and it's fantastic. And I got to sit in the chair with the arms on, which was quite. I did, yeah.
Well, because we were so concerned about making sure that everyone knew that it was still the Prime Minister that was in charge. So there was a big risk when you genuinely have a risk, and we really did have a risk that the Prime Minister was ill, that people would feel like, well, okay, they could start disobeying the might of Number 10. And actually at that point, particularly in COVID, it was so important important that we kept the discipline. So yeah, I remember making you sit in the big chair.
You do wonder what sort of country it is, though, when you're looking at yourself going, "Oh, crikey, am I nominally in charge today? This feels like not a serious country."
It was Dominic Raab.
Dominic Raab,
Yes.
who was absolutely fantastic during that
Magnificent.
period of time.
Absolutely magnificent. It's one of the best bits of public service I've ever seen in my life was the way that Dominic Raab took that chair for those, after you'd vacated it, obviously.
Got it warm few
weeks.
The job. Warmer upper for Dominic Raab.
Now that is like a court.
There are worse places to be.
It would be great to have some of your general observations of being in Number 10. There's a new team in there now, obviously, with Andy Burnham, who I'm sure will be wanting to make all kinds of changes, make a big impact, a first fantastic 100 days, as everyone likes to talk about. What are the kind of best and worst bits about working in that building?
I think there is something wonderful about just walking in every day that you don't forget. And I felt every day was a privilege. You sort of walk through the door and you do kind of pinch yourself. And I think for the almost 2 years I was there, that never stopped. And I think I was obviously particularly lucky to have a wonderful office with, and it's just, you kind of pinch yourself and think this is wonderful. And then the day sort of, starts and you bang your head against a wall for how, Minister 17 has made an absolute balls up of something again that should have been relatively simple. But, we carry on. And I think, so the building itself is magical, although I think very few people appreciate also what an absolute mess it is in terms of, there was in the press office, there was a massive hole in the wall for about 6 months that never got filled in. And, we really should.
Except from your head banging.
Probably. But we should spend much more money in terms of on the building and making it, it's a wonderful historic building, and it does feel sometimes that it's not fit for purpose as an office. And I think it's against those little political things because everyone's terrified that people are going to go, they spent money on Number 10, which is I don't think any other country in the world runs quite this way. So it'd be quite nice if all the parties got together and just said we should obviously be doing this and make it a wonderful state of the art sort of building and renew its heritage.
It was quite a good idea for a Downing Street trust at one point, if you remember.
Yeah.
That got slightly waylaid by some wallpaper.
Yes. Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast.
How about if you got to go back in, have your time over, is there anything you do differently?
Key thing I would do differently, and this will shock you both, I'm sure, is try and take more people with me for the changes that we were looking to make. I think we were a bit of a blunt instrument, which in some regard did work, and we moved some things quickly. And I think we always felt, given the difficulty in the relationship with some of Boris's wider circle, that we might not be there for a long time. So it was, how do we try and create as much positive change as possible? But I think partly after the election, there was maybe a bit too much hubris. And that meant that we there was enemies made that we just didn't need to because we were just running at things maybe a bit too quickly. And I think trying to change everything all at once was probably a bit of a folly, and we should have focused on areas of change. And I think we could have also brought more people in internally and been a bit more collegiate. And we would have ended up getting more things done. So I think if I was ever going to go back in again, I remember there was things like people like Peter Hill, who's PPS, who is brilliant, and we worked with briefly under Theresa May. And there was a lot of, because Brexit was the big thing when we went in, it was like, we've got to make sure everyone's on board with where we're going and things like that. And those sort of people we should have really made an effort to buy in and bring on board. And, because I think there's a lot of really great, particularly civil servants, who would have loved the energy of the team and what we were trying to do after probably a bit of a stale period during Theresa's time. And we just didn't do enough reaching out, buying goodwill, all those sorts of things in politics that I think are really critical. Because I think there's a bit of hubris, and I think it gets worse when you have more success. So you go and win elections and everything's going well. It's very easy to fall into that pattern of things. So.
Yeah, Doug, I totally agree with that. I think if you look, it's one of my regrets, I think, of the wasted opportunities of that particular period in our country's life that could have actually been so profitable. And there were alliances on both sides, actually, that I think there's a missed moment on the civil services side as well, I think, from my perspective, looking back on that, where we could have made more happen more quickly, but it felt too often like we were the wrong side of the table, that we weren't even round together, actually.
I think as well, if you look at much of what was identified that needed to change we look at, people saying how the levers don't work and all those other things, I think there was a diagnosis for what was wrong with the state and ways to fix it that was broadly the right one. I think it's now a sort of common consensus for much of these discussions. Everybody from sort of, Tony Blair to Nigel Farage broadly seems to agree with a lot of these things. And that was a sort of unique moment where I think you had people brave enough and smart enough to deliver on some of that, and it didn't happen. And I think that's the thing I really do regret looking back, because I think the country would be in a much better state than what it is now if we'd have got that right.
I totally agree. And look, you mentioned before that you've now, since leaving Number 10, you have a company which I should confess I have benefited from the strategic advice of. Lee very generously came and talked to the Shelter Board last year with his political insight, which was hugely helpful. So while we've got you in the hot seat, can you just give us your view on where you think we'll be in politics next year?
Across the board.
Everything. Everywhere, all at once.
Yeah, I don't particularly see a lot of things changing. I think we will see Andy Burnham has a very short window. He has a sort of 90 days or so, 100 days. There's always these things where people are going to look at him and make a decision. At the moment, I think it's like 52% of poll I saw recently said they had no opinion on him. They hadn't made their mind up. So they're going to look and they're going to see what he's about and they're going to make a decision. A bit more promising, I think, than Keir, but he's going to face some hard challenges. And I just think that the size of the challenges and the problems ahead may well damage his flourishing reputation quite significantly. I think Kemi seems to be, doing well tactically and within the party, but is making no headway in the country. I don't really think the Tories will move very much at all. And Reform, who seems to be having a bit more of a choppier element of it, are still holding up relatively well in sort of polling. So I think the most likely element is we're going to end up in a very fragmented parliament next time round. And that in itself, we could see a sort of left-wing coalition, probably the most likely, but I actually think we might end up with a sort of Tory Reform coalition government. But I think Andy Burnham will be crazy to go to an early election, so I think we're still a few years off that. So I think we'll see something probably similar to what we've seen for the last couple of years, just on reheat over and over again, until we get to an election, and then, we will see.
What seems quite interesting is people talk about the party leaders a lot. So there's Kemi Badenoch as a figure, or Nigel Farage, or Zach Polanski, sort of Ed Davey, Andy Burnham, and not necessarily attaching them to their parties so much, for better or for worse. But it does feel like everyone's trying to be a person with a microphone, campaigning, doing interesting stuff online and so on. Have you got a bit of advice for anyone in particular, or for all of them in general, about how to sort of nose ahead of the others and do things a bit differently?
I think we live in an age of authenticity, and that is what people are looking for. The sort of previous political generation, it was all about the line to take, holding the line, and I think we've seen that everybody is fed up with that. It feels inauthentic. You don't answer questions. So I think the public respond well to people who are just honest and authentic and come out and say it as it is, so to speak. So there is a certain definite benefit for remaining authentic, as I think Andy Burnham's trying to do at the moment. But again, fundamentally for me, it's looking at what is the moral story of your party and you as an individual. How are you going to fix the problems of the country? And there should be a story to be able to tell for that. And I think the big challenge that I see for many of the parties is they're very good tactically. They'll pop up at PMQs and they'll talk about things individually of themselves. But I don't see a sort of larger thematic, this is how we are going to fix Britain, in a sort of also a bit more optimism about how we're going to do things and sort of building that story out. So at the moment, it's, I think particularly when you look at, look at Kemi or you look at Ed Davey, it's just they are individual sort of stunts and events, and they're responding to things. They're very much just responding to events, not framing events for themselves. I'd like to see much more of that if they're really going to sort of get traction. People have to believe this person can make my life better. And we look at those individual pollings. The one thing that you do see is people don't believe any politician. They don't trust any politician. They don't think any of them are going to deliver for them. There is an overwhelming cynicism, which is why Andy Burnham won't get long. If people look at him and go, actually, you're just the same as all the rest, it will quickly slide. So you've got to get out of that, and you've got to tell a great story, and you've got to identify how you're going to get change, and fundamentally you've got to be serious. You've got to be able to deliver change and know what that is. It's not about comms. It actually is about something so much more. It's about being a politician with substance, and being able to really identify of what are the problems we face, how are we going to fix them, and then telling a story about that afterwards.
Just a last one then. Do you think someone who has made the weather for themselves in the last couple of summers is Nigel Farage? Obviously, Reform really went on the front foot with their press conferences, and it's quite interesting to see the nation's media are normally able to take a summer holiday, and suddenly they were having to go out to like airport hangars and stuff like that to see their latest announcement. Do you think we've got the Clacton by-election coming up in a week or so's time? Do you think he's got it wrong and he's overshot and he's maybe been a bit too authentic on this one? He's kind of been himself and cooked it, as the youths say.
I think it's probably the best card he had to play at that point. He's in a very difficult position. And it was likely to just be a death by 1,000 cuts. So you may as well try and take the ownership of it, win the election, and then you can say, well, the voters have seen this and they don't care, and this is all Westminster bubble nonsense, etc. So it probably works out well for him overall. Ideally, you wouldn't be going directly head-to-head with Count Binface. But I think it's probably the right strategy from where he's landed himself in. But the real question is, when you're looking at donations and all those other things, is Helen is much more an expert in this than I am. But if you can't explain openly and transparently what you're doing, then there's a question of, again, it's not a comms problem, it's a policy problem, and that's for whatever reason isn't around that, they've got themselves into difficulty. Very similar to the sort of stuff we'd often end up dealing with Boris on, and then you're dealing with what's the sort of the worst best option sort of thing, or the best worst option.
Yeah, and you can tell whether you've got a problem with the length of your answer. If you've had to craft a paragraph in response to any of those questions, you're sunk.
Yeah, agreed.
Advice to live by. Lee, thank you so much for joining us in Lessons for Number 10.
It's been a pleasure, guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lessons from Number 10. Remember to follow the show on your podcast player of choice, and do leave us a 5-star review.
Please do email us with any feedback and questions. Our email address is intheroom@independent.co.uk. If you're listening on Spotify, you can also comment under today's episode with your thoughts, and you can keep up to date with all the best bits from the podcast on Instagram. Follow us at intheroom.pod.
This podcast is part of the Independent Podcast Network and is produced in association with Next Chapter Studios.
The executive producer is Rod Adahali, and the producer is Sam Durham.
And a special mention to content editor Maya Nushka, video editor Vali Raza, and videographer Dan Faber.
And we'll see you next week.